the DC PCSB website under the coronavirus page, which we now have, and the LEA sharing library. We'll also post any and all materials from this presentation up on that site. So if you can please make sure as you join this chat to introduce yourself and put in any questions or comments that you have along the way into the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to the amazing Alicia Robinson and our other guests to introduce themselves and dive into this essential conversation.
No pressure there, Simmons. Amazing. Okay, we'll try to be amazing here. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us so bright and early on a Monday in our new reality. Excited to have the three guests that we have with us today here, talking about equity and how we keep it at the forefront of our COVID-19 response. As Simmons said, just kind of as housekeeping again, if you don't mind sharing who you are, where you're from in the chat. We'd love to hear that, and just say hi and how you're feeling. Anything you want to share in there. We'd love to keep the chat active throughout this conversation too. So feel free to write questions throughout, and we will be having time for questioning at the end of the session primarily. We, again, would love for you to kind of keep sharing these questions and anything, comments and anything you're thinking of. Just a note too on the chat and also on your video and on your name, that a lot of you, as we planned this kind of quickly, I sent out lots of communications over the weekend inviting people to be on this. So some of you logged in with my link, and so you might be showing up as me. If you go into the top right corner of your video screen, there should be 3 little dots where you can rename yourself if you choose to. Otherwise, you can also just continue to be me. I could use that right about now. Some help being me. So do what works for you. And so let's just go ahead and jump right in. We, have been thinking a lot, obviously, and all school leaders, all schools, and all of you parents that have kids in school didn't plan for this situation that's going on right now. And it has become this big kind of social distancing, social learning, distance learning, homeschooling experience, but it kind of really isn't because it's not real distance learning or real homeschooling, but really crisis related work. So as we particularly kind of think about like how to deal with the crisis part of this and do the things that are best practices around homeschooling and best practices around distance learning and such too. Something that keeps swirling around in my mind a lot, and I think probably the minds of a lot of you, is how is equity playing into this? And so as we think about equity, just in general around the coronavirus, we've been hearing a lot, and I think about the last week or so, about how we're not getting to understand the kind of racial disparities, the different economic disparities that the virus is having. But we are pretty sure, just because kind of history tells us that people that are closer to the margins and people on the margins of the margins are likely to be most adversely affected by that, by the virus in general, and then by the overall impacts in general of what's happening with it. So those impacts are crossing over all kinds of sectors: economic, health, obviously, housing, and of course, education. And so our panelists today, I think I'd love to ask you your first question and also have you kind of introduce yourselves at the same time. Our 3 panelists today, I would love to kind of ask you to share your thoughts on why should we as schools and school leaders stop to think about equity? Again, share who you are and where you're coming here from, and what your role is kind of in this response as schools are grappling with this, as well as what you think about the answer to that question. Why should we stop to think about equity right now? Caroline, do you want to start?
I was going to say, who's going to start? How much time do we have? Okay.
You can give us about 2 minutes.
2 minutes, perfect.
So I know we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, I'm Caroline, really happy to join the conversation this morning. And just if you're not familiar with me, I run a group called the 228 Accelerator, and we help organizations and schools scale equity within their organizations using our signature framework, Equity by Design. So we can talk about that more later, because I want to spend the next 90 seconds talking and responding to Alicia's question. So one of the things Alicia said is like, why should we stop to think? And I think sometimes stopping to think is probably the most powerful thing someone can do, because it allows us to reconnect with ourselves. You know, when I think about equity, I think the core, I think equity in its spirit is like radical inclusion. And I think sometimes we talk a lot about, you know, including a lot of people. And I think that's important, but we can't include a lot of people until we do the work on including ourselves in all parts of ourselves. I think this particular challenge in crisis is going to create an experience of universal suffering that we have not seen in our country and in our generation. And if we are not able to say, I need to integrate my spiritual self, my physical self, my emotional self, and my mental self, if those pieces aren't integrated, and if we're not stopping to do that and showing up as those full people, then as leaders, we could become fragmented and create fragmented responses. So I think as a whole, I think, you know, equity requires wholeness. It feels like wholeness to me. And if we are to create whole solutions, we have to be whole people. And the stopping to think is actually doing that reintegration for ourselves. I think my role in the response, like hats off to any person that's close to schools, because you all are on the front lines right now. I think that if we're not on the front lines, and those of us who have the privilege of having some distance, I think it's being a thought partner, being a leader, helping school leaders say, look, if you need some time to think, here's 30 minutes on the balcony. What are you thinking about? You know, what is your response? How can we help you make sure that equity is at the center? Because if we're always reacting, it might not be what comes front of mind, or we might not have the most creative solutions.
Thanks, Caroline. Raymond or Simon, whichever one of you wants to jump in next.
I can jump in. So, I mean, I rarely disagree with Caroline, and this is not going to be one of them. So my name is Raymond Weeden. I'm the executive director at Thurgood Marshall Academy here in DC. And I like the concept that Caroline talked about, radical inclusion and universal suffering. So in our thought process at TMA, what we're thinking about is like, how can we help students and families honestly take care of the basic hierarchy of needs? Do they have what they need physically to be safe? Do they have what they need to be emotionally be safe? And if not, how can we either help them, giving them something, provide them with a resource, or just giving them space? We do a weekly call with families where they can just talk and chat and just honestly vent. Many of our families are the ones who are saving us, honestly. They're the grocery store workers, they're the Uber drivers, they're the food delivery folks, they're the folks who are cleaning our homes and houses. And so when we start thinking about equity, is this concept of like, everyone's on online school, like, yes, and when mom is at Giant or mom is at Whole Foods, she's not at home with her family, and so they may not be engaging in work, whatever it is the way that my two are right now in their own rooms. And so we try and think about like, what's the best way to make sure that students have what they need just to be safe, that families have what they need to be safe, and then our team honestly have what they need to be safe. Statistics are that somebody is in a unhealthy situation right now in this quarantine, whether it is that there is someone who is abusive, someone who is like in the middle of a drug situation, and we have to stop and think about that when we're making decisions about what is right and the actions that we're going to do. Because if we don't, we are more likely to continue to widen the equity gap, which schools, including my schools, are already struggling to do a good job about that in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everybody.
Simon, welcome.
Thanks. So I'm Simon. I was the founding principal of DC International School. I'm on the board of Washington Leadership Academy and work in a variety of ways with other charter and public schools here in the district. And my son is doing his homeschooling for DC Charter School down the hallway. And I want to second everything that Raymond and Caroline said, and in particular, along with Caroline, to give a real shout out, gratitude, and awe to those of you in schools right now, or working for schools right now from home, and especially I think for folks who are parents and working for schools like Raymond, trying to deal with kids at home and kids in their schools. And I think that any advice that I have needs to be tempered with just giving yourself the grace to be keeping going in this moment, in whatever way you're doing that. And any kind of work that you're doing, any kind of care that you're giving yourself, people in your home, people in your schools, counts and is impressive given the situation. I also think that stopping and thinking and creating room within your organizations for some folks to be stopping and thinking about what's coming down the line is crucial, because what's going on right now is that if we keep going on the trajectories that we're on, worse, which is I think the way that everybody sort of feels about the situation, right? We are not doing what we were doing. We're not doing it as well. We're not taking as good care of our kids. We're not taking as good care of our schools. Teaching and learning isn't as good as it was, of course, because we didn't choose this. A trajectory that is what it was before, but worse, is going to lead not only to worse outcomes across the board, but greater gaps and greater inequity. And so stopping and thinking about how we can do things differently and change that trajectory is all the more crucial right now, if we can make room within our organizations for some folks to be doing that while also caring for the day-to-day needs of everybody.
Thank you, Caroline, Simon, and Raymond. Appreciate those reflections. And again, want to echo what a few of you have said just now, too, that thank you for being on the call today. Thank you for thinking about this issue now and in the past. If you are on the call today, you obviously have care about equity, and you care specifically about equity in education. And I love this quote that if equity is only your priority in times of ease and surplus, and it was never really your priority. If it's ever been a priority for you, it's now is it's even more of a priority for sure. And I think that sentiment will echo throughout this conversation today. As we talk today, our objectives really are to unfortunately not solve all the problems of equity that we are experiencing now or will experience in the coming months, but to really give some early suggestions and considerations and some kind of ways of being, I think, in a lot of ways, on how to make sure that we are keeping equity in our minds as we move to solutions and move to thinking about next steps. With that in mind, let's see, moving along here. As I said before, and I think a lot of you echoed in the conversation we just had too, we have kind of been hearing a bit about like this disease, this coronavirus pandemic is kind of this great equalizer. It can happen to anyone. It is happening to everyone. But we can predict that the poor and people of color communities will experience exacerbated effects of the virus, as well as all of the side effects of it. So, you know, there's an old African-American saying that's like, when white folks catch a cold, black people get pneumonia. And I think this is like that perfect example of how we're going to actually see that play in real action. And as we think about that even more, I'd love to kind of jump into some of the things Caroline and well, let me first ask, I think Raymond, you also just shared a bit about what's going on at your school. I'd love to just hear from you guys, anything else, Raymond, that you'd want to share about what's going on at your school, as well as Caroline and Simon, with the folks that you've been doing work with and connecting with in schools over the last few weeks. What are some of the things that are showing up that are concerning to you about issues of equity?
Yeah. I would say some things that are showing up is like, so while we did our best effort at the time. I would say best effort at the time. What we didn't know is in terms of making sure students had quote unquote materials in order to do work. So on Friday, Friday the 13th, we opened up our laptop carts and made sure we did a quick survey with students, like who had technology, gave Chromebooks to students, gave them, make sure they went home with textbooks, because, textbooks and books are actually important in this process too. What we found out like the Monday or Tuesday afterwards is that it was great that we gave those out, but we didn't take into account that, like, if our student had a Chromebook and then they have two other siblings that needed to use that same Chromebook, essentially we don't have enough devices in a home in order for students to be able to use it within their own schools. And we're all kind of giving quote unquote work in order to keep students active. So we're finding like things like that we didn't really plan for are showing up and manifesting. So we're still trying to continue to make sure we have equipment out there. The other thing that we're noticing is that students who struggled in school in the first place are really struggling in this work that we're giving now, because the type of touches or engagement that we have for our teachers who are balancing their own lives with families are just not enough to enrich their learning. And I would say the last thing is that what is showing up is that, to what we just talked about, is that when we make our weekly phone calls, and each person, anyone who's on a payroll, has between 5 to 6 students that families that they're responsible for calling. Each week we're getting more and more stories about families being sick, or families who are who had to go to the hospital but then were sent back home and just told to self-quarantine. And what that does is it increases a stress level that was already hyper stress. And so when we talk about our seniors who are in the middle of getting acceptances for college, or still preparing for the AP test, which is a whole nother bucket of nonsense in my mind. I'm going to stop there. It's a whole another bucket of nonsense in my mind. It's just like this weird dystopia. Like, this is not reality. And I think if we all could just take a moment to just stop and pause, it may help us to come up with better solutions. But we're still pretending as if like we are not in the pandemic, and doing that is really making life difficult for our families.
Caroline and Simon, what would you add to what you've been hearing, experiencing?
Yeah, so I think like this this nugget of leadership capacity is really, really important. I'm going to tell the story of 2 different districts in 2 different states. Like, one district, if you could imagine, the leaders are scattered all across the city. Some don't even live within the city that they're teaching. And their big challenge was making sure that the most marginalized and excluded had a continuous experience, right? But because they weren't proximate or connected to the school system, they really had a hard time understanding what social services that they could leverage, what all the pieces that are available to really connect to the experience or even understand it. And what was interesting, like just talking to them and helping them see like what assets that they had, they realized that, wow, we have food trucks that are going into communities every single day. We can put instructional packets on the food truck.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, like that, like while we can't get there, there is someone else that I can lean on, another relationship that's already existing, that's already strong within the city that I can leverage to make sure that the relationship within the school and the most marginalized excluded have somewhat of a continued learning experience. So when to this point, like how important it is to stop and think and have someone else to say like, wait a minute, like, you know how to do this. And the one woman said, oh yeah, I used to be a librarian. We have bookmobiles. I was like, yes, like this is a time to lean on to all parts of ourselves and pull those assets. The other district with high leadership capacity, they had already figured out how to make sure that the learning experience was continuous, you know, all the way from school to the most marginalized and excluded family. They have a very, very resourced CMO. So what they were thinking about is like, to Raymond's point, we're in a pandemic. Like, things are not business as usual. The state test is off the table. What is most important for kids to learn right now? right? How do we then leverage and put power in the hands of parents to teach their kids about the government just infused $2 trillion into the economy? That's going to affect you down the road. Like those, because those are big conversations that, that some, like, I don't know if teachers feel equipped to have, or even understand all the moving parts, like what is happening right now in our country? Why weren't we able to respond swiftly? Like, what is the relationship between the federal and the state government? Why aren't people doing what they said they're going to do? Like all of these pieces, I think at this other CMO, they're like, oh, we're going to take the shackles off and partner with parents and look at parents as teachers right now, because we can't do it. We're not in front of kids as, you know, there are other young people or other siblings that are in front of kids, other cousins. So, I mean, they were really wrestling with this idea of like, how do we cede power to families to say like, what's most important to learn right now? If we say like, if we're in a pandemic, they're like, well, we don't have a state test. That is just not happening. So they were just like, once we say that's not happening, like, well, what is most important for kids and families to do and learn in the next 3 to 6 months that will position them as better citizens on the other side of this? And that's something that I think that taking time to think is really important, because like history is happening. I mean, it is happening, and how do we seize these moments of learning, and say like how do we seize these moments of learning in order to really have kids and families be able to prepare? Because this is not going to be a sprint. This is a marathon. Like once they lift quarantine, we're going to have to keep pacing ourselves to this. And I love the way Raymond said like, oh, I'm just going to take my AP test. Like really? Like that's assuming that colleges are opening in the fall. Like there are all these assumptions. Like I think people just like, are we in a pandemic? Oh no, this is just going to be 2 weeks and then we're going to go back to normal. And it's like, what if it's not? And then how do we just get comfortable with that mystery? And how do we move if that's not what's going to happen?
Simon, anything you'd add from the conversations you've been having?
Yeah, I love Carolyn's focus on learning and on changing what we want students to learn. I want to hold off on that for a minute just to talk about one of the other functions of schools that folks I talk to are really struggling with, which is just checking in on kids and checking up on kids when you're not seeing them on a daily basis. I love what Raymond talked about you know everybody on the payroll having 5 or 6 families that they're keeping in touch with. And I think that's, particularly with an equity lens, one of the most important things schools can do right now. If you know a teacher has a small group Zoom session scheduled with 3rd graders and there's a 3rd grader who's not showing up to that, is that because there's one Chromebook in the house and too many people are sharing it? What's going on with that 3rd grader, and how else can we be making sure that we have systems in place to reach out to that 3rd grader, and that responsibility is spread beyond that one overloaded 3rd grade teacher. At the same time, one of the things I'm hearing a lot from school leaders is concern for the kinds of functions that schools give, whether it's food, psychological care, checking on signs of abuse and neglect. How are we as a city providing those kinds of services that are usually located at schools, not because they're educational services, but because that's where kids show up every day? How can we be supporting families and supporting kids in the absence of those daily touch points? And I think that's something that can't be on schools alone to figure out, but needs to be on a full citywide approach to figure out. But it's something that I think school leaders are really worried about appropriately.
And Caroline and Simon, you've both recently written pieces, I think that both came out last week, offering some thoughts on how to bring equity into those long-term COVID-19 recovery strategies. First, do you have any particular recommendations that you think, and I think Simon, for example, you just said a few, but any other recommendations you want school leaders to be thinking about right now? And then the second part of my question is just tell us a bit about what your recommendations are for the long term too, as we, right now in DC at least, we don't know exactly when schools are coming back into session. Some of us have some guesses, but as I know I was talking to Raymond about on Friday, I think you guys were making some long-term plans right now without even knowing what long-term looks like. So again, particularly thinking about the pieces that you wrote last week, what are the immediate recommendations and what are some long-term things you want school leaders to keep in mind?
Simon, do you want to kick this off or do you want me to?
You can, unless you need a minute.
No, I would say first in terms of, like, I'm thinking about this notion of process as product. It's how we are reacting to this time of uncertainty and crisis is just as important as what we do. So I was like, how often do we put in stock checks and pacing ourselves to say, you know what, at the end of every week, we're going to check to see if our plan's actually working. We're going to check to see how we are connecting with the most marginalized and excluded. We're going to spend the time to call families and get their input. And I think, like, having that being a routine, and knowing to say, like, this is the data that we're going to look to, both common measures and uncommon measures, to assess whether or not our plan is impacting the lives that we wanted to plan. So I think, like, throughout this year, like, putting in those regular checks throughout the process. I think as we think about next year, it's like, how do we think about the most marginalized and excluded students and say what has to be true for them to have a really solid experience, a transformative learning experience for the next 18 months? Start to build that now, right? So maybe it's like saying some of our leadership, like, we want you to start thinking about next year, or we're going to spend some time thinking about next year and just kind of like using the resources at this point to think about, like, what if we don't open next year, right? If schools aren't opening till October, this is, God forbid this doesn't happen, but let's make sure that we have a thoughtful, equitable response to that, so we're not reacting to it. I think this is the time we can say, like, what version of the world do we want to create if these are our constraints? And the piece that, we released last week is, like, these are just some questions that we could ask ourselves to prompt that thinking, because in times of crisis, it is often our panic selves and our lower selves that react, and not our higher selves that respond. So we need to have time to think and the right questions for response. And I think this time is asking us to respond. So how do we build in that time to do that? And we offered some questions to prompt creative thinking, especially through the lens of the most marginalized and excluded.
I, of course, as always, agree with Caroline. I want to add a focus on rethinking curriculum, both now and thinking about the future. Kids are, by and large, going to be learning less right now. And so what is the most important things right now for kids to be learning when we think about the education side, in addition to the duty of care side? And how can we be thoughtful about making sure that our kids, and as Caroline said, particularly the most marginalized kids, particularly the kids who have been struggling up to this point in this year, get the most important parts of the curriculum, because they are going to be getting less. The other piece is when we get back to school, whether it's May, whether it's September, whether it's October, there will be even bigger gaps in what kids have learned. They won't necessarily be the same gaps that we saw before, but we are just getting less of a sense on a day-to-day basis of what our kids are learning, and they are getting radically different experiences as they are learning from home, even more different than they would be getting if they were in school. And so how do we think about giving them different experiences to address those gaps when they get back to school? That is, if they're in elementary school, they won't have learned in the same ways all of the math that was scheduled for March, April, May when they get back. If they're going on to the next grade's math next year, they won't have learned all of this grade's math. And of course, that's most true for the math teacher, as the math teachers out there in math in some ways, but it's true for every subject area, that we can't expect that the march of learning will have gone on. And so we need to be planning for how are we taking into account the radically divergent experiences that kids are having now for when they come back. And I want to second what Caroline said. I think that one of the most important things that leaders can do right now is figure out how to create capacity for that planning, because just taking last year's curriculum and planning to teach it again this coming fall really won't work. But it also won't work to just add to the already overloaded plates of those who are trying to teach on a daily basis to be rethinking it now. So creating, in effect, a now team and a planning team within your schools, I think, is one of the most effective things that leaders can do.
Awesome. So let's break this down a little bit more. I think any of us who are familiar with Caroline's work know about your focus, Caroline, on equity by design and that framework in general. So thinking about, tell us a little bit about which parts of the framework apply most to the short term, how they fall into the long term. And again, I think the piece that you sent out last week talked a little bit about the equity by design framework, but also shared this kind of tool that I have on the screen now. Thanks, Simmons, for putting the full article in the chat too, for those of you who haven't seen it already, and you can access this tool there too. But Caroline, kind of talk us through this a bit and how schools might be using this framework as they guide their short and long-term thinking and planning.
Alicia, you're assuming that time is linear and not like an instant in moments, that one thing has to happen before the other. Come on now.
Oh,
okay.
Okay. Thanks
No.
for that.
No, but
this is why I call Caroline to get me grounded in the right things. Okay.
No, I would just say, like,
it.
we can't go wrong if we start at the margins. I mean, that's where our work typically doesn't start. I mean, I think that's where our, by virtue of the way our culture and our society is built, like the more power, privilege that we attain and amass, like the further away we get from suffering. So I think in terms of transforming ourselves, like we got to be comfortable going to those places, calling those families, understanding what their school experience is, what we want it and what it could be, right? And then I think we're at this really unprecedented moment that we can design the future that we want, while some of the barriers and walls that have previously constrained us are now a little bit more malleable. Like I could not imagine someone saying the state test is not going to happen. Well, it's not happening, right? And so it's like, oh, there are these these walls that we thought were rigid aren't so rigid now. So what version of the world do we want to create? I think in starting to build it, there's something, and I'm working with some school leaders in Chicago that are building schools. And we're like, do you realize, like, for the first time, maybe in the past 15 years, everybody's at home. So if you want to talk to this rock star school leader, if you want to pick up the phone and talk to people, this is the time to do it, right? This is the time to say, hey, we want to have a meeting with so-and-so. And like, how can we use technology to create different types of relationships between people, linking people in different ways, like stretching, like challenging these borders around zip code, challenging these borders around state lines, like challenging, like, because independent schools, parochial schools, public schools, and charter schools are all going through the same thing. Like, how do we say, yeah, you know what could happen if we talked to this teacher at Sidwell and we talked to this teacher at TMA and they were collaborating? Like, we could start to build that out right now, and it could live in an online place where the walls that we design are the ones that we build, right? Like, so I think, like, it's how do we balance, like, the margins, like, what could be if, and then say, like, this is the way we want the world to look like. And I think that, like, that's what makes this, when I get to my low points, I was like, no, we could figure out what we want, and not necessarily deal with what currently is. And that's going to require a ceding of power. That's going to require us to think about like the relationships in ourselves in different ways. But I think, like, toggling back and forth between, like, if we're really for equity and we're really for radical inclusion, and we want to create the world where all of these artificial markers on our bodies don't predict our life chances, like, how do we build that right now? And how do we use internet and connectivity to do it right now, and the universal experience that we're all in right now? Like, there's a universal language that's being built that's transcending the way our bodies show up. And just creating a space for us to think about the beauty in that suffering, and how we can emerge stronger and a more connected people on the other side of it.
So just a follow-up question on that. I think I think in our normal way of doing things, our normal like way our minds have been trained to work, some people will then ask the question of if designing at the margins, excuse me, will then mean that some students and families that are furthest from the margins and therefore maybe closest to privilege would get left out. How do school leaders address that?
I don't know
And
if I understand
particularly
your
address
question.
the like, particularly addressing the like parent that might call and say, you're not doing enough for my students, when their student might have a lot of other resources and things like that, that you are then designing more at the margins for students who have less resources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way, well, I mean, I think a couple things. I think one, this is going to be a time and a moment that we extend grace to people and understand that contradictions in humanity are going to show up. So one, how do we respond to that? But I think the first question is, starting with myself, it's how do I keep my attention on the powerless and the most marginalized? It's like, because those people are in your ear, does it mean you give them your attention? They just might be in your ear. And I think those are two stakeholders you have to balance, but I think also communicating that we believe that if we figure out the conditions for success for the most marginalized and excluded, they extend to everybody. And having families recognize that. Like, what the reason why we're starting here is that because what has to be true here will help you too. That might be hard to understand because the level of proximity, there's a lot of distance, but I think just having people sit with that concept and telling people that's how you're making the decision could be really helpful. I think for leaders, it's like keeping the eye on that, because it's so easy for other people who have more power, they have larger voices to get your attention.
Gotcha.
I think this, yeah, I think to what Carolina said, this goes back to the importance of having multiple ways of gathering information that may not be conventional, to make sure that like the person who may be emailing in all caps has just as much of a input as the mom who is only able to jump on the phone for 3 minutes once a week and share her input. Like they're equally weighted, and actually maybe more weighted towards the other mom. I think this is also a place where where Caroline has in here, like making the invisible visible, is also like really opening up and naming like what are some serious growth areas that school or the organization or the community had before all of this started, right? Like this is where we were before it started, and this is what we predict will happen as a result of this. So if we don't address this now, it makes it even more of a human rights, like this is the right thing to do campaign. And then going to Caroline's final point is like, and as we are developing and thinking about the students who are on the fringes, like the students who are getting it, or whatever getting it is, will also be blessed as a result, because now the community that they're learning with is that much stronger in the long run.
Simon, I'm particularly interested also to hear your thoughts on that concept too, particularly having worked at a diverse by design school, where I think you might have been weighing these options, these different voices a lot. And I think even in the piece that you wrote last week, that particularly focused on the over-reliance in our existing education system of one-size-fits-all instructional delivery. You made some suggestions about moving away from that. How do you tell us more about that, and how do you kind of move away from that and answer to those parents who are like, well, that's, what I'm used to, and things like that?
Yeah, so I think that there is your internal message and your external message, and I mean mostly your internal message to yourself as a leader can be different from the public-facing message from what you're saying to all parents. Not that they're contradictory, not that you're lying either to yourself or to the public, but what you're emphasizing. Certainly to yourself, I think that, Caroline's point is exactly right. Just like special education teachers have practices that are good for all kids, even those who don't have disabilities or identified disabilities. The practices that are good for folks on the margins are actually good for all kids, because they are meant to capture the widest range, because they are more individualized, and because, frankly, everybody has struggles. I also think that making sure that you have good, clear messaging for the full school community can really help the folks who are most empowered and most likely to call you up. If you can proactively be telling folks, this is what you're doing, this is what we're doing, this is our model. I'm one of those privileged parents with, college degree and kid in a diverse public school, concerned about my special snowflake and so on. But as long as I get sort of a weekly email from the school that sort of clearly articulates, this is what we're doing, this is what we're struggling with, this is what's going on, I'm going to be much less likely to send a pestering email to the school leader or to want that special treatment for me if the public communication is good. The other thing I would say, though, is that the more that we can be individualizing instruction and figuring out assessment that can lead to better targeted instruction, that will serve everybody. I didn't create this, this picture that you're looking at, but it's a quote from something I said. And I think that it goes back to what I was saying before, that when school reopens, kids will be having had such a radically different experience that we can't pretend that we're going to be serving them all well by giving them all the same thing. I think that was true before coronavirus too. I think probably many of the folks on this call I know have been thinking the same thing. But I think this can be a real push to redesign what's going on in our schools when we do come back together. I think that will take a bunch of planning for different models than we have now. Two things that I think in particular we need to be thinking about are assessment. How can we be really clear on what's most important for our students to learn when they come back? And how can we know as quickly as possible where kids are in relation to that assessment? And scheduling, both for students and for teachers. How can we be creating more small group time, more kinds of rotations for kids among different kinds of learning experiences, and leveraging the online tools that folks are using right now, not to keep with sort of an online only education when kids come back to school. That misses the point of them coming back, which God knows I as a parent and as a educator hope they do sooner rather than later, but so that we can be creating the opportunities for teachers to be doing what they do best, to provide kids targeted instruction, preferably in small groups, and keeping an eye on where they are. That's going to take a different kind of schedule in which teachers have more planning time and more small group time, which I think can be made possible through good use of online learning time for kids, but a different kind of schedule, both in elementary, middle, and high schools than we typically have now.
And I just, I want to open it up to questions, and go ahead, as I said earlier, if you have questions that you want to put in the, to pose to our presenters here today, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll spend a few minutes before we wrap up at 10 with your questions too. But something that you all have touched on a bit, and I think I'd like to just dig into a little bit more, is just this technology piece of it has been kind of the most popular solution to ensuring student learning isn't disrupted, particularly as a first line solution, right? And I think some of you brought this up already, but I'd love to hear if you can talk us through about some of the equity implications for that. I yesterday got to see, well, two things. Saw these slides that kind of point out that in America that vulnerability is highly intersected with race and poverty, of course, as we keep talking about. I think Raymond brought up earlier that, kind of using technology as a solution when there are families that are not all just sitting at home in a situation like many of us are getting to deal with right now, where there's a device for every child, or there's a quiet place for every person to go to, is challenging. But also then saw this picture yesterday that implored people to kind of think about, when you're saying work from home and submit your assignments online, this might be what home looks like for some kids. And so thinking about that, tell us, Raymond, we'd love to hear any of your experiences with implementation of distance learning that you want to share, and what, from all of you, any recommendations or solutions you might have to make sure even the students on the margins have some access to learning.
So, I mean, I'd say the first thing that we, and actually not first thing, are still trying to do, like after we think about their physical and emotional needs, is just like what is possible. And so We historically, how we have tried to problem solve is, the leadership team gets into a meeting and we start coming up with solutions for everyone, which doesn't work. So this time we actually said, look, here are the 4 buckets that we're really struggling with. Anyone who wants to be part of these committees, please jump on and be part of these task force. And through that iterative process of teachers, non-instructional staff, and other folks, we came up with some things that we're going to try after spring break, which mainly is like, one, let's respect the fact that 75% of the school year happened. If that happened, then like what needs to be true in order for a student to be successful, whatever this last quarter means. And if that means that we need to look at more one-on-one instruction for a small group of students, that means that we need to do more small group instruction for another group of students. And then there's a group of students that can do whole group. Like we can completely blow up what our structure looks like right now. Because one, we've always had that capability. We're our own LEA. And then 2, like we're able to like then start to address the needs of students. So if it means that so-and-so needs a book, a physical book, like who can order that book from Amazon and send it to that family's address? If it means that a family that maybe in the image like you have right now, like really doesn't have time and access to engage and work in the way we want them to, like, is there a way that we can do an alternative something, maybe even if it's just like, hey, get a book out and journal every other day for us to make sure that we are stimulating their brain. So we're trying to be innovative in this. We're struggling with this. And so what we have tried to do also is work with a couple other single site high schools, and about once a week we jump on the phone and say, look, this is what we're thinking about. What are you all thinking about? And through that process, we'll be able to get some solutions. We're sending some information to our families. The questions this week that we're asking in our weekly conversation is like, what's not working for you in the work we're doing? And we anticipate to get some good feedback from our families about how we can do better. We kept our spring break the same. So post spring break, which would be the 27th or 20, whatever it is, the 20th, when we will allegedly only have a week before we go back from this stuff. But we know that's not going to be the case. So I would say we're struggling with it, but we're also like willing to struggle with it, knowing that like we are only going to get smarter in how to serve families and students better if we fail, quote unquote, in some early ways.
Sure. Simon, Caroline, what would you add to that?
Caroline, you want to go?
I was on mute. Simon, you take it away, and then I'll punctuate.
Yeah. I think that this is part of why I'm so concerned about the disparities when students get back to school. I don't want to emphasize my privilege, but I want to accept and admit it. Like, my son has high-speed internet. He has an educator for a father. He's got a math tutor that he's meeting with on Zoom. Like, he is learning just fine at home. There's plenty of things that he's not getting. But the image that we're seeing on our screen, that's not his experience, but it certainly is the experience of some of his classmates. And so I think that some of the solutions that Raymond has talked about for right now are really important. And also, when we have more capacity to make a difference in students' lives when they get back to school, it's important to check ourselves about what kinds of experiences they may have had while they were at home, and plan to do everything that we can to close those disparities when they get back to school. I also think that that's one of the reasons that I would emphasize the kind of checking in with students that Raymond talked about. I think that the ability to have a human connection with a teacher, with classmates, with knowing that there are folks out there in the big world that love you and care about you is one of the true functions of schools that most schools tend to do really well. I think most teachers are, caring people who care about kids, and kids can know that. And even if it's a phone call that's not about work, that just is saying there is somebody back at your school who loves you and cares about you, that will matter whether or not they're submitting their assignments online. Having a package, the Amazon package that contains a book from school, if a school can do that, that will show that kid that they are cared about, and that matters hugely.
Yeah, I don't
Caroline,
know if I have
anything else you want to add there?
No, I can tell you what I think. When I see this picture, I tell you what's on my heart. Like, I read this really concerning article, and it made me think about, like, are we moving to a world where human connection, especially human connection across difference, will become a luxury of the rich because everybody else will be doing this distance learning thing? And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan I'm a huge fan of innate technology enabled education, but it is, you know, I'm just like, I think that's just something that we need to be aware of and concerned about.
Yeah, that's a good perspective to keep in mind too. You, as I promised at the beginning of this call, we wouldn't solve all of our problems today. I love what you said, Raymond, about being comfortable in dealing with the struggle. I think that's what we all need to be doing here, is that, you know, we're going to fail and sometimes fail fast, hopefully fail fast and figure out what the next solution is and a better way to do that. But we need to be willing to try some things and struggle through it. I want to give some time for some of the questions that are in the chat, and then some final comments from our presenters here today, our special guests. And I think, first of all, Maya asked a great question of, I wonder if there's actually an opportunity to center the most marginalized students before school reopens for all, and if there's an opportunity to accelerate learning for students who have often been left behind. If we can leave daycare open for essential workers, why can't we reimagine and offer school for students living in homeless shelters, as an example of students on the margin? What can we do to seize the opportunity to support students who need the safety and security of school the most in this world of physical distancing? And I think Amanda, thanks, Amanda added to that a bit too, of thinking about the hierarchy and need for community connection. How do we connect with all students and staff and make sure we're not adding more stress? So any thoughts from any of you on that idea of how do we, Caroline, you kind of just started to bring it up a bit, like the students that need safety and security of school the most, but are dealing with this physical distancing. How do we deal with that?
You know what, Alicia, when you were talking, and hey, Maya, it made me think about like a leader that I worked for a long time, and who was probably like for the past, 10, 15 years in education, like she was the part of the vanguard, Jenny Niles, right? And it makes me think about like, oh shit, we're the vanguard now. Like, so it's not up to us to look to other people to do it. It's up to us to do it. And just say, like, not ask the questions of other people. It's like, oh, what do we need to do? Like, what do I need to do? Like, how can we start to say, like, what are the new organizations and what are the new connections that we need to make it happen? I think sometimes it's like, I can always look to see ask the question of other people, but it's like, how do I need to show up in that way and start to integrate that into my design and what I'm moving and what I'm building? And think about, this is like our design challenge. And it's like, and if we can do it in our city, then we can be a proof point to what can happen around the country. But how do we see that as our own responsibility, and start to blur some lines around parochial and independent? And like, how do we start to say, like, all those lines, we built those walls. We can tear them down if we want to. And a lot of those walls are designed to keep the marginalized from the included. So how do we say, like, it might be uncomfortable for me to go to a homeless shelter and ask what they need, but maybe that's what I'm asked to do. Maybe that's the kind of leader I'm asked to be right now, because I have power, I have privilege, I have access, I have money. So, how can we as the powerful and the privileged start to move into places that make us uncomfortable so that we can show up as the leaders we were designed to be?
I just co-sign on that. I mean, I think the more that we can use whatever capital that we have at this point, like in order to break or rearrange how things are, the better, right? So, seeing certain people on here, like, oh, I need to now talk to, some of the policymakers who are on this call, to make sure that we're providing space for the schools who are really trying to do something different during and after this, that they're not, quote unquote, being penalized as a result. or hey funders, like this is actually, I know that the funding that you have targeted is for X, but we actually now need it for Y. And here's the direction that I'm going to go. Like, are you with me or not? And being able to make those very deliberate and just the right moves, again, will be tough, and people are going to have to like grapple with that. But the more that we can model the way and break out, and then get other people to lead with us and maybe lead in front of us, I think the better off we'll be.
And I think Jessica Sutter adds to this too, and I think someone else did also. How do we reconstruct the reality in a way that does not add more stress? And how do we plan and design but not burden stress people with implementation that adds pain? And I think, I wonder if Jessica's thinking like I am too, as somebody who is not working directly in a school right now. That has been a huge thought in my mind, like how could I be helpful but not also add more stress to X school leader or whatever. And I wonder if there are, and Maya also points out, like, how do we go ahead and start doing this now? Like, we've got a lot of great minds on this call. I will make sure, I'm going to share my screen in a second with just all of our contact information too. I think, for one thing, I'd be happy to have people email me if you're interested in being part of that thinking. That might be something that I can talk with Simmons and Nicole here about as we think about what PCSB's response is and how we use this time and collective community space to come up with solutions. But any other thoughts that anyone might have, any of you on the panel might have about how we help but not add stress, essentially?
I would say stay in relationship. I think there's a difference between pain and torture. And this is going to be painful for about everybody, but it doesn't have to be torture. And I think if we stay in relationship, we stay connected to who we are. I think that can make anything, I think any uncomfortable, discomforting or unpleasant experience bearable. And this is where I think I opened up saying that integrate all parts of ourselves. Like, I don't think we're given anything that we can't handle. The question of, are we willing to rise to the challenge? So I think when things become unbearable and they become stressful, I think we extend grace and forgiveness, and we go home, we sleep, and we wake up again, and we try again. And we know that this is not a sprint. This is going to be a marathon. So we pace ourselves, we pace each other. We take care of each other and ourselves, and we continue to have our focus on the right things and the right people.
Yeah, real quickly, I would say, I think this whole this thing about other folks have a bandwidth. Like Alicia, you asked me that same question two weeks ago, and I still haven't come up with it. If you can keep asking, right? But if you can keep asking that question though to people who are in it, right? Because I haven't quite officially slowed down to really start to think as the way I should. But if you keep asking it, eventually I'm going to say, you know what I can use, Alicia, is X, Y, and Z. And then we're more likely to start distributing the wealth that way.
And I love Caroline's suggestion too of just finding ways to, like, it's funny, one thing we do have a commodity on right now in some ways is time. Yeah. So how can we just get on the phone and be a listening ear, or connect with somebody who might just have a different way of thinking about it, or whatever. Being available for that, I think, is possibly a great thing. Anything else you'd add, Simon, or any last thoughts you'd want to add to this conversation as we wrap up today?
Yeah, I want to just come back to this idea of grace. I think that some folks are feeling like they have a lot of time. Some folks are feeling like they have much less time, kids at home, things like that. And so giving, and Caroline talked about this as well, giving yourself and other people grace, and recognizing that there are opportunities here, but it's going to take stopping doing some of the things that we thought we would be able to continue doing or are trying to continue doing to make room for some of those opportunities, and being okay with the fact that we are not doing some things as well as we would have done otherwise. We just can't.
Yeah. Grace is really key. Any last comments, Caroline or Raymond, too? before we sign off. And again, the